It's good to see everyone this evening. Appreciate your making the effort to be back out tonight and to be a part of our service. As of April 2016, there were over 1 billion websites on the internet. I don't know about you, but I have a hard time wrapping my mind around the idea of 1 billion of anything. But let that sink in. 1 billion websites on the internet. Now, according to one website, and I realize I'm going to one website for information on another, but according to the internet, the average website contains 250 pages on average. Some have a lot more, some have a lot less. So even if you're not a math whiz, it doesn't take a lot to figure out. We're talking about 250 billion pages of information. And this doesn't count pictures. This is just pages. Talk about the information age. And you know, like most things in life, the internet has some good things as well as some not so good. It has some pros, some cons. It has advantages. There are definitely some disadvantages. And because we live in this information age, because I'm sure that most people in this audience tonight use the internet to some degree. It may be a smartphone, it may be a tablet, it may be just a laptop or a home computer, whatever. But most of us use the internet to some degree or another. And so we need to deal with this issue. And we need to have the same determination that was shown by Joshua in the Old Testament. You remember what he says? He's approaching death. He knows he doesn't have long to live. And there in chapter 24 and verse 15, he says, "If it seems evil unto you to serve the Lord, choose you this day whom you will serve, whether the gods which your fathers served that were on the other side of the flood or the river, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land ye dwell. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." And I would suggest that as children of God, as Christian parents, as Christian young people, we need to have that determination that says, I'm going to serve the Lord regardless of what the rest of the world is doing in regard to the internet. And as parents, we need to be conscious of what can happen to our children online and what can happen to us as well. You don't need me to tell you that there's some real dangers for society, for people of all ages. And it's not because people are necessarily bad. It's not because they're necessarily going out looking for bad things on the internet. If you spent much time, you know it's very easy to find things that you weren't looking for. To wind up places that you really had no intention of going. Even in searching for pictures for PowerPoint presentations, sometimes things are there and you wonder, why is that there? It has nothing to do with what I did a search for. And so for this evening, for the next few minutes, I want us to consider some of the pros and cons, the advantages and disadvantages of the internet. And I want to preface this by saying, as we consider these dangers, we're not talking about any newly invented sins. But we're talking about newly invented ways of doing the same old sins. The text that Matt read for us from Ecclesiastes chapter 1, verses 9 and 10. To summarize what Solomon said, he said, there's nothing new under the sun. We sometimes think, oh, we've got this new. No. We have new ways, we have different ways, but it boils down to the same sins that men have always done. And even with our technological advancements, the devil is still throwing out the same temptations. He just has new and better ways to promote it. I've chosen to... Sonny, is that not clicking? How about it, BK? I've chosen to title our lesson, as I announced this morning, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. And I'm not going to tell you some of the smart aleck remarks I got about that, asking who I was going to be preaching about tonight, so we're not going to go there. And somebody, I thought it was Ned this morning, but it wasn't. I found out they did when I announced the topic. Wrong movie. That was High Plains Drifter. So come on, if you're a Clint Eastwood aficionado, you know that's the wrong theme for the title that I've chosen. This is from the '66 movie that Clint Eastwood did. But let's begin by noticing the good. I want to start off on a positive note. There are a lot of good things about the internet. The internet provides a lot of blessings for us. For example, the internet has given us a fast, free means of communicating with one another. I mean, we have instant messenger, we have the internet, we have Skype, we have FaceTime, and there are probably things out there that I don't even know about. Because I make no pretense of being a techie. I make no pretense of staying on the cutting edge. You know, I'm still learning the old school part of the internet. But it is easier to email someone today than to sit down and type out a letter. How many of you remember typing letters on a typewriter? I do. I remember writing them out by hand. And you know, you'd print it out, not by hand, but you'd print it out on your typewriter, and then you'd fold it, you'd sign it, you'd put it in an envelope, and you had to find a stamp. You had to get the address on it, and then you knew it was going to be 2, 3, 4 days before it got. We don't do that anymore. You type a note on your computer, and boom, within a matter of seconds or minutes, that letter is there. Thank you, BK. Didn't realize we were up. And because it is much easier to email someone than it is to write a letter or send a card, it's easier to stay in touch. It's easier to stay into contact with people. Internet mailing lists for churches make it so much easier to send out information about church activities. Not to mention the fact we don't spend all the money on postage that we used to spend. And you know, because we are the household of the faith, Paul says in Ephesians 2, 19 and 20, anything that helps us be closer to one another can be an asset. And as children of God, we ought to want a close relationship with our brothers and sisters in Christ, not just within our congregation, but elsewhere as well. We live in a relatively cold society. You know, people just don't spend a lot of time talking and communicating with one another unless it's just a terse text message. And so because we can communicate with family members, we can communicate with church members and other congregations, this can be a great blessing. But not only that, the internet can be good for discussion or for education. You know, if you have a question, a biblical question or a spiritual question that you want to discuss, chances are you can find someone or someones on the internet who perhaps have a better knowledge, a better understanding of the topic that you're wanting to study, and they'll be glad to discuss it with you. You know, if you look out there, there are countless discussion groups, there are message boards, there are chat rooms, there are social networking sites, and on, the places that you can go to find information, not just on biblical topics, but other topics as well. And many of these, I might add, are done by faithful brethren. They're very sound, they're very educational, they're very biblical, but at the same time, got to be honest, there's a lot of nuts out there. I mean, you don't have to look very far. You can find somebody that espouses anything and everything in the name of religion. So you've got to filter out the bad. And when I say bad, that which is doctrinally unsound. But the fact is that many of them are good. You know, in Acts 2 and verse 46, we find the Christians in Jerusalem assembling, we're told, on a daily basis. And part of this was to uplift one another, to edify one another. And we need that today. And sadly, most congregations meet 3-4 times a week for an hour or so. You know, 4 hours out of 172 is not a lot of time for us to be together. And so nowadays, you can go online, you can go to a chat room, you can go to a discussion forum, and you can discuss whatever Bible topic you want to talk about. You can research information, you ask questions about the topic that you're trying to study and to learn about. And this is especially helpful for Christians in areas where the church is not strong, perhaps a very small congregation or an area where there are not a lot of congregations. People can go online, they can study the Bible and learn a great deal. And the internet encourages a bond between those people who are studying together and brings us closer together. But not only that, the internet can be a great resource for Bible materials. And I know this overlaps a little bit with the point that I just mentioned, but there are numerous, I dare say there are tens of thousands of websites out there where you can access articles on Bible topics. You can get Bible maps. You can get teaching resources. You can get class books. You can get almost anything you need in the way of being able to teach or to learn or to study. You can find maps and photos there that oftentimes are free to download. They're printable, and I know a lot of our Bible teachers print out their own materials, the things that they find online. You can even find commentaries. You can access multiple translations of the Scriptures, and most of them are free to help us in our study. And I would suggest perhaps this is the Internet's greatest offering to us as children of God, the fact that we can study, that we have access to all of this good material. Not only that, there are several good schools, Bible schools out there that you can take classes from. You can either take it for credit or you can just audit it, and many of them are free. World Video Bible School has a tremendous Bible program in which you can take textual classes, topical classes. You work at your own pace. Not only that, there is the Online Academy of Biblical Studies, also known as OABS. And so there's a whole litany of things there that we can study to improve ourselves as children of God. But not only that, the internet can be a tremendous tool for world evangelism. It's unbelievable to me, the idea that you can study with someone in China, in Africa, and South America at the same time. You can study with multiple students at the same time through the internet. You don't pay overseas postage. You don't have to wait. I remember in the 80s when I would correspond with preachers and Bible students in India, it would take as much as a month to 6 weeks for the letter to get there. And anything over a half ounce for them to mail was prohibitive cost. Today, they go to an internet cafe, and for just a few cents, they're able to go online and they're able to study the Bible. Over 3.2 billion people use the internet today. That's a lot of people, 3.2 billion people. That's approximately 44% of our world's population of 7.5 billion people. Think about that, being able to reach that many people. Now, obviously, not all of them are interested in spiritual matters. A lot of them don't care about the Bible. Many of them don't believe in God, but out of that number, there is a tremendous potential for us to be able to reach out and to teach these people. It's unique in the fact that, and maybe this is one of the things that makes evangelism so successful on the internet, because there is the anonymity. People can go online, they can research Bible things, they can search for the truth, and they don't have to worry about being face to face with someone. You know, our society today is far different than it was 50 years ago. There was a time when you could knock on a door, would you like to study the Bible? And people would say, oh yes. And they would invite you in, or they'd invite you to come back. Today, it's hard to get people to do that. But that same individual who would say no to you coming in and studying with them, they will go online and they will log on and they will study the Bible with you or someone online. That's how society has changed today from what it was many years ago. And it may seem strange to us who are a little bit older that anyone would go to the internet to search for spiritual truth. But just look at the statistics, how many 100,000 people in a week's time access the various websites searching for biblical information. And maybe this explains, at least in part, the tremendous drop in magazine and newspaper circulation, because people aren't going to the newspaper for their news. They're not reading the magazines, the print form, when you can go online and you can read them on the internet, on your phone. You know, young people today use the internet to find out about a restaurant. If they're thinking about buying a car, they go online and they can find out about the car, the pros, the cons. They can get the Carfax and find out if the car's been wrecked. They can look for almost anything they want through Amazon and other sale places. The internet is taking over. And so we need to be taking advantage of that opportunity to reach people, whether it's offering tracts and Bible materials, which we do on our church website. And by the way, I don't have an exact number, but I know we receive a lot of hits on the church's website. We have people who watch as we stream our services on the internet. In fact, barring problems there, Joanna's watching the service on her laptop tonight, as she did this morning. So we have a tremendous opportunity to put the gospel out to people that we might not be able to reach otherwise through the printed page or through door to door. But now, enough of the good. Let's go on and consider the bad. Just as the internet has some good qualities and can be used to preach the truth, it can also be used to promote and spread error. And the idea of false doctrine, the idea of spreading error, is nothing new. Paul had to deal with it. Acts chapter 15, you had the Jewish Christians who were trying to enforce or bind circumcision on Gentile converts. In fact, the whole book of Galatians is dealing with false doctrine and with error. However, the internet allows the dissemination of this error at a much faster rate. A man can write a book or a bulletin article with error, and maybe a few hundred, perhaps 1,000 or more people might see it. But you can put that same false doctrine on the internet, and within a matter of hours, a matter of days, it can be seen by 100,000 people very easily. And because of the widespread reach of the internet, we as Christians and especially elders need to be diligent and watchful for false doctrine that might crop up. You say, well, why is that? Well, years ago, you'd hear somebody say, oh, we don't have to worry about that doctrine here. Nobody around here's heard of it. But with the internet, you hear about things that are nowhere near. And consequently, somebody hears or reads something on the internet, and they can come into the congregation and they can begin to ask about that, but telling others, hey, I read this. And before long, they've got a foothold in the congregation. Whereas years ago, that probably would not have happened. And again, years ago, I've actually heard elders say, well, you don't need to preach on that. We don't have a problem with it. Well, we don't have that here. But today, that's no longer the case. And sadly, many have made shipwreck of the faith, as Paul wrote in 1 Timothy 1:19 and 20, because they have been deceived, either through the printed page, but in recent years, through the false doctrine on the internet. And believe me, there's a lot of it out there. And false teachers are taking advantage of this opportunity. I mean, you can get Jehovah's Witness doctrine, you can get Seventh-day Adventist doctrine, you can get Mormon doctrine, all kinds of, and even from our own brethren. There's a lot of false doctrine being espoused. Peter warned about this in 2 Peter chapter 2 and verse 1. He said, but there were false prophets also among the people, even as there shall be false teachers among you, who privately shall bring in damnable heresies, even denying the Lord that bought them, and bring upon themselves swift destruction. But I want to mention another bad thing about the internet, and that's the piracy of music, books, movies, and other copyrighted material. What I'm about to say may make some of you uncomfortable, but it's still the truth, and I hope you'll listen to what I have to say. Downloading and sharing digital files that are copyrighted property is a serious problem. It's a very prevalent problem, and sadly it's a problem even among people who would call themselves Christians. People who would never dream of walking into Walmart and picking up a book, a CD, or a DVD and walking out without paying for it, have no scruples about going online and copying or downloading copyrighted material. And yes, they're the same thing. In both cases, we're taking something which doesn't belong to us. We're taking something that we've not paid for. And I realize there is some music that's free to download. There's some books that are free to download. But many of these things are copyrighted, and usually it will say it there. The simple truth of the matter is that piracy of music and movies is much easier than shoplifting because, first of all, it's anonymous. Who knows? Other than you and God. But not only that, most people consider it to be harmless. I've had Christian young people say, well, what's the big deal? I copied some songs. I know people who've copied thousands of songs off the internet that were not free. They had no problem with it. But brethren, listen to me. The piracy, the downloading of copyrighted material is stealing. It's just not printed stealing. Someone has copyrighted that material. Read the laws. And aside from the fact that it's illegal, and if you get caught downloading, pirating, the fines are quite heavy. But more importantly with that is the ethical issue. It's sinful to take that which belongs to someone else. If you earned your living writing, whether it's songs or books, papers, or whatever, and people were copying it without paying for it, you wouldn't appreciate it. And yet that's exactly what we're doing. Piracy is piracy regardless of whether it's Blue Suede Shoes by Elvis Presley or whether it's some other religious song, Blue Skies and Rainbows. And again, I want to be perfectly clear. When we make illegal copies, whether they're printed copies or whether they're digital copies, we're stealing from the writer and the publisher of that material. And such is wrong. But another bad thing we find on the internet is internet gambling. Gambling can be roughly defined as covetousness, expressed through attempts to gain something for little of nothing at the expense of someone else or from others. Now, while gambling is strictly legislated in the United States, you see the internet has no such rules. And I realize if you look into it that internet gambling is technically illegal, but they can't catch them. It's almost a crime that's impossible to prosecute because they have no way of locating the source of this. Many, if not most, online gambling sites are based in other countries where there are no restrictions. In fact, if you look back the first, and you'll find a discrepancy in the date, some sites say that the first internet gambling site was started in 1994, others say it was 1995. But the point is, over 20 years ago, people began gambling on the internet. And in 20 years, there are now over 2,000 gambling internet sites. You can bet on ball games, you can bet casino games, you can play lotteries, you can play bingo. You can bet on anything you want if you know where to go on the internet. And the gambling internet revenue just a few years ago was estimated to be in excess of $20 billion a year. And you don't even have to go to a casino. There's not the shame, there's not the embarrassment of going to the old gambling halls of bygone years. You simply turn on your computer and you can bet and gamble to your heart's content. It's estimated that today there are over 25 billion people gambling. 4% of all teenagers have a gambling problem today, and the numbers for adults are even higher than that because of the ease and the accessibility of it. And perhaps the anonymity of the internet makes it so attractive because nobody knows that I'm gambling when I'm doing it on the internet. Perhaps there are other things we could mention, but I want to briefly consider the ugly side of the internet, which is the third point. Obviously, the main thing that I would include under this heading is the idea of pornography. Ever since the 90s, the internet has been marked by tremendous growth, if you will, of pornography, both what they call softcore and hardcore pornography. And again, the combination of anonymity and lust have made it a very lucrative market. People are making millions and millions of dollars peddling flesh over the internet. It's estimated that the porn industry is a $57 billion a year, and that's only what's known about. A lot of it is not known. But $57 billion a year nationwide. The United States share of that market is $12 billion a year for internet pornography. Child pornography, and this one bothers me even more, $3 billion a year for child pornography. And in recent years, the mobile phone pornography is growing in leaps and bounds because you can take it with you. You don't need a laptop, you don't need a tablet, you don't need a desktop, you just simply go to your phone. Do you realize that the combined revenue of pornography on the internet exceeds the total value of ABC, CBS, NBC, which those are estimated at $6.2 billion. And yet, internet pornography grosses twice that much money in 1 year. And let me quickly add here that pornography is not an addiction as some would have us to believe. At least it's no more of an addiction than any other sin. We could talk about it. It's not an addiction, it's a sin. It's a serious character problem that needs to be dealt with. It must be dealt with, or it will keep one from heaven. And there are a lot of other kinds of sexual immorality available on the internet. There are what's known as internet chat rooms, and I've never been to one, so I'm only telling you what I've read. But in these internet chat rooms, you've got men and women who indulge in, for lack of a better term, harmless flirtation with people of the opposite sex. And sadly, even some Christians engage in this. But how many times, and I don't have a number on this, does this harmless flirtation lead to outright adultery or fornication? What starts off as just harmless talking, harmless chatting, leads to something far worse. And there are websites for people looking to find sexual partners in their areas. And this is nothing more than high-tech prostitution. And it's wrong. As Christians, we have no business participating in such. And another ugly side of the internet is the sexual predators who go looking for children and young people to prey upon. These degenerates, they know how to approach children, and oftentimes they pretend to be a youngster themselves, and they get to know the child, they get information on that child. And how many times do they persuade that young person, and sometimes 14, 15, 16-year-old, especially girls, agree to meet this predator somewhere? For whatever reason. and the results are oftentimes detrimental. There are between 24 and 30 million children online at any given time of the day. And a high percentage of those are in chat rooms and social networks, whether we're talking about Facebook, MySpace, Friendster, Zangsta, but they're on there. But a lot of these so-called children, according to police and authorities, aren't children. They are adult sexual predators posing as children. One study that I found said that 1 in 5 young people today had received sexual approach or solicitation over the internet in the last 12 months. 1 in 4 teens had had an unwanted exposure in the past to either nudity or sexually explicit pictures. And yet this is a problem that for the most part is ignored. Many parents, especially Christian parents, think, oh, that never happened to my child. Oh, no, it never happened. It does happen. It doesn't happen just to poor kids. It doesn't just happen to kids from the wrong side of town. It happens to all kids. It's a real problem that must be addressed. But finally, I want to address the question that perhaps many of you as parents are asking yourself, what can we do? What can we do about this danger? Well, I would suggest to you that there are many websites and services that can protect you and your children. Sites such as Net Nanny. There's another one called Covenant Eyes. There's one called PC Monitor. And these sites, and I'm certainly no expert in these, but they can filter out what's accessible on the internet so that certain things, and you can control the degree of control that these programs have for your children. But look into these. Young children and even teenagers need their parents' direction and oversight. Parents, you need to know where your children are going on the internet. And I know the children aren't going to like this. But parents, you need to know what sites your children are visiting on the internet. And one of the best precautions is to let your children know, I want the password to your Facebook or whatever social media. And I'm going to check it periodically. I want to see who you're talking to. I want to see what kind of chatting is going on. Otherwise, you don't know who's talking to them. You don't know what's happening behind the anonymity of that screen. And if you don't know how to check, talk to someone who is computer savvy and find out how to keep up with it. We have a responsibility to keep our children safe. Somebody says, oh, I could never do that. It says I'm not trusting. No, it's not about trust. It's about being careful. I had a father call me from another congregation just 2 or 3 weeks ago. He said, I've got you on speakerphone. I want to ask you something. He said, my son looks up to you. He respects you. I want to ask your opinion. What do you think about a parent that goes to his child's Facebook account and reads it? I said, a good parent is going to do that. And I heard the boy in the background go, huh. He didn't want to hear it. Now, he may not think too highly of me now, but I went on to say, parents have a responsibility to protect their children. And this is one of the ways, is to know what they're looking at online. Dr. Keith Abloh, who is a psychiatrist, had a very interesting point here. Just want to read 2 lines. Parents need to know that the internet can be disinhibiting to young people and adults alike. And then he went on to say, people do things on the internet that they would not do in daily life. They offer information they wouldn't normally offer in an interpersonal interaction that's more human. Again, these monitoring services, Net Nanny, Covenant Eyes, and others that I mentioned, they're good, they're helpful. But as a parent, you've got to be proactive. You can't rely on a computer program to do the work of a parent. So don't just get a filter, get involved. In conclusion, when all is said and done, the internet's a fantastic tool. We can use it for good things, for positive things, for educational things, or it can be used for detrimental things. It can be used for sinful things. The fact that some have used it to perpetrate sin, sinful activities, does not mean that we have to condemn it or avoid it entirely. You see, the internet is like any other tool. Whether we're talking about a printing press, the printing press can be used to print bad things. It can be used to print good things. The television can be used for good things. It can be used for bad things. Radio, the same thing. We have to distinguish. And so rather than just throwing the baby out with the bathwater and saying, oh, no, we should never use the internet, no. We have to control it. We have to use it in the right way. And that's what it boils down to. And let me say that I've only touched the hem of the garment. It's amazing how much information is out there about the internet regarding some of the problems that I've talked about, and certainly there are many other problems that I've not had time to address tonight. But I hope you'll think about this, and as Christian parents, be proactive. Know what's coming into your home. And one final recommendation, don't let your child have a computer in the bedroom. There's no supervision. It's too easy to go places, not saying that they would do it intentionally, but they stumble on a website somewhere they shouldn't be, and mom's not here, dad's not here, I'll just check this out. And before long, it's a real problem. But by having that computer somewhere where it's visible to siblings, to parents, or others, lessens the temptation, the likelihood that they're going to go places they shouldn't, or if they stumble in places they shouldn't be, they'll get out of there. Knowing, number one, they might be seen. Number two, knowing that mom and dad are going to check the history of that computer. But we're going to close our study for this evening. I hope you'll think about these things. We have a tremendous responsibility to our children and to ourselves. And I want to emphasize that the problem is not just one for teens. It's not just one for young people. It's a problem for men and women, for boys and girls, for people of all ages. And we need to pray that God will give us the wisdom and the strength to know what's right, to do what's right, and to avoid the bad aspects of the internet. But we're going to extend the invitation of Christ now. Tonight, if you desire to become a Christian, you can do so, coming in faith, turning from your sins, confessing the name of Christ, that He is the Son of God, and being buried with Him in the waters of baptism for the forgiveness of sins, that He might add you to His body, the church. Or perhaps you need to come back and make changes in your life or make some things right. You can do that as well. If you need to respond to this invitation, will you come while we stand and while we sing?